I'm Barry Cassidy.
And I'm Tony Barry.
Welcome to Back Barries, a podcast on Guardian Australia. Well, the government has gone surprisingly hard on renovating and reducing the size of the NDIS in the hope that it will save it from itself. And will that prove to be an early signal of the approach the government will likely take in the federal budget, or a rare one-off? Tony, the growth of the NDIS was at 10%, which is unsustainable. There was talk a few weeks ago of reining it into about 5 or 6%. The war happened. Now, whether that's relevant or not, but it certainly made the economic situation more urgent. It finally comes in at 2%. Now, given the rate of inflation, that's a real cut. It was quite a dramatic announcement.
So I can discuss this because it's on the public record. Indeed, when we did work for the NDIA about 2 years ago, I think now, as is typically the case, journalists put in FOI request, or government departments and agencies requesting all sorts of details about expenditure and so forth, and polling and research, which all government departments do, inevitably comes up in that suite of questions that journalists ask. And one of the questions was about any research that the NDIA had conducted. And I think one of the things I like about Bill Shorten, he was the minister at the time, was the request goes into the ministers and the contractors, whoever they might be, and for any sort of objections or redactions. Bill Shorten's response was just like, put it all up. So they released the entire report that we conducted, unredacted. Not a single word was redacted, and it was released to the media, and it's now up on the agency's website. So it's one of those very, very unorthodox things that Bill Shorten does, which I think makes him quite likeable.
So what did you find in that research? Because all the indication was there was great enthusiasm around this when it started. But then it got to the stage where there were so many concerns over the fraudsters and maybe too many people who were ineligible and the high cost. Did that start to come in?
So the segments that we researched were participants or their parents and non-participants, citizens. Voting specs wasn't part of it because the agency doesn't care which way people vote. They just wanted to know about what the community thought of it, what was the social licence implications, what do people think the strengths of the program was, what were its weaknesses, what were the information gaps that people wanted to know more about. What we found was that overwhelming support, the values that underpinned the NDIS, particularly amongst obviously the participants and their parents, had very positive associations. And amongst those who don't use it and didn't expect to use it, they also thought it was a very valuable, important social infrastructure, that if they did one day need it, it gave them great peace of mind to know that there was a system in place. Insurance was inevitably the word that came up. So that were the positives, but then the negatives amongst the participants or their parents, and including some of those who weren't, but through word of mouth, friends, their social circle, family and loved ones, were concerns about the behaviour of some providers. And inevitably a word that came up in a lot of focus groups was, this is a wedding tax. And that's language that the minister used as well. Was, participants would sort of say, my son would get therapy for $80 a session, and as soon as we qualify for NDIS, it went up to $240. And it's a wedding tax. It's like, buying some flowers, $50, but if it's for a wedding, suddenly it's $150. That sort of undermined a bit of the social license for the program. And it wasn't sort of from media reports, which people sort of treated with some skepticism that there was a bit of mayonnaise on the story. What they responded to were, their own experiences or from loved ones as well who had these sort of experiences as well. So that were some of the problems that, obviously the government has looked at. I think there was broad acceptance that there were some challenges. It was a policy that I think Phil Curry described this week as a good policy that needed to be repaired. And so the process is now beginning.
And I'll give you another example of the wedding tax as well that I heard on radio with a woman, a mother from Western Australia, and she had a Down syndrome child. And she felt that her child was more than capable of learning a lot by going to TAFE
Yep.
and just joining in.
Yep.
And when the NDIS came along, she was offered a 6-day training course specifically for Down syndrome kids for $20,000, which they would pay for.
Yeah.
So again, these kind of things just sprouted out of nowhere, and it was the operators as well. There was no registration, no screening, no training.
Yeah.
And now at least there'll be some sort of vetting, and hopefully they'll get on top of that. But the problems remain. And now because 150,000 people will fall off it at least, maybe more. And so the states are going to have to pick up some of that slack for the less severe cases. And the Premier of New South Wales has made it clear. He said, look, we've got a lot of responsibilities as state governments. We've got to look after the hospitals and the schools and crime, and we can't do it to the level that maybe the community will demand. So that's they've only got halfway there. They've got a long way to go in terms of the negotiations with the states.
Yeah. And it's a really important reform that I think, to preserve the importance of the scheme, some tough decisions need to be made. Otherwise, they'll lose all social license. If it's allowed to keep on growing and allegations of poor behaviour by some providers continues, then the real risk is that it collapses altogether. And Phil Curry's piece this week had a lot of comments from Labor MPs and ministers expressing these concerns. In fact, one of them sort of said off the record, if we had our druthers, we'd start it all over again, because when it was first implemented, the consensus view is it was rushed, and consequently some of those processes that needed to be in place to prevent some of these problems occurring weren't done properly and adequately, and then subsequently overlooked by following governments and ministers. And now, the time has come to preserve and protect that institution of the scheme. The interesting thing to me is Mark Butler is the minister responsible for this, and he is regarded very highly amongst colleagues who operate with him. He doesn't perhaps have the profile of some other ministers. You wouldn't say he's a relentless self-promoter. He's just quietly goes about his work. A lot of my Labor friends who are plugged into the federal government always express surprise to me that Albanese, when you're talking about who succeeds Albanese when he decides it's time to go, they sort of say it's always odd to them that Mark Butler's name is never in the calculations, because he's highly influential internally. He's from the left, which of course is the dominant faction in the federal caucus. And I think this is a bit of a dress rehearsal for him to show his colleagues that when it comes to making tough but necessary reforms, he can introduce them and then sell them successfully and preserve the importance of these institutions for the Labor Party. Well,
that'll be interesting to watch, because he certainly handled himself well all week, and it was such a big announcement, and I thought he argued the case. He sort of raised the issues and then knocked them down one after another. The test will be, of course, as this unfolds, and quite apart from the states getting on board, there are aspects to it. Waleed Ali raised one about how Scott Morrison talked about kicking people off the NDIS and setting up sort of individual and independent assessments, and he was accused of undermining it. And now that's precisely what they're doing. And as he put it, they accused Scott Morrison of trying to do this by stealth. Now they're making a virtue of it. And that's certainly in terms of the politics, that's what Mark Butler did. But the other way is now the new assessment on people who should be eligible for the scheme. And the test will no longer be diagnosis, just pure diagnosis. They say that's too subjective. It has to be now around functionality, really, yep. and they'll go from 10 down to barely functional at all, and that's the kind of criteria. Now that's fine. That's probably a worthwhile exercise. But imagine how many people are going to be involved in that. There'll be about 400,000 people that need to be tested in one way or another. A lot of hours, a lot of money. And that's precisely the sort of stuff they're trying to avoid.
Yeah, I mean, obviously one of the big things that sticks out is on the NDIS figures, 16% of Australian 6-year-old boys are diagnosed with autism and on NDIS accordingly. You look at countries like Norway, which is a country that often is used as an exemplar. it's around 0.5%, and New Zealand, nearby neighbour, it's likewise around 0.5%. So those figures, indicate that there's obviously some explanation. I'm not a medical expert, but that's obviously driving some of this reform.
Now, they say $15 billion, which will prove, I think, to be the biggest saving in the budget. Reading between the lines, though, at news conferences and interviews that the Prime Minister gives, you do get the sense that there is an appetite for something about reducing assistance for housing investors, some tinkering with capital gains tax, negative gearing, perhaps, but I don't get the same feeling about the 25% levy on gas exports. In fact, you kind of pick up the opposite vibe when you listen to what he's saying, that because when you start running an argument that's contrary to those who want it, it's not a good early sign. He doesn't seem to be softening up the electorate for that one.
No, in fact, Albanese at the end of the week did some media where he refuted some of the claims from the advocates to say that, it's around $22 billion paid in company tax. I don't think that included payroll tax. So he was digging in. And Barry, as you recently, discussed, at the moment, our security partners in terms of the countries that he's doing deals with for fuel supply, and we don't know how much longer this is going to go on in Iran. Trump, of course, is totally unpredictable on this, and he's obviously lost all control. So, Albanese's got to look at those suppliers and their relationships, of which this has been a central part. And the other thing which I think has not been discussed is it was only 2-3 years ago when the Albanese government did some minor change to the resource rent tax, some tinkering, but they said there'll be no more changes for 10 more years. Now, there is a consequence to your relationships, commercial relationships. If you change again, business craves stability and certainty. And, to change after saying you won't change for 10 years, it's a little Trumpian, to sort of just change your mind again. And I think, Albanese is very aware of those relationships, particularly at this uncertain time. And, you read some of the sort of commentary in the Wall Street Journal about if the Straits were to open up now, and they always talk about on-water inventory. The on-water inventory at the start of the conflict is now completely used. And so, the process for these ships to restock and then supply and then refined, it's going to be months and months. That's if it was to end immediately.
The other argument he puts is companies pay some taxes, but they don't pay anywhere near enough. And I think David Pocock, the independent senator from the ACT, has really, he starts to put it in very simple terms now. He says that it's time. You, the Australians, you own the resources and you get nothing, and all the profits go to overseas companies and their shareholders. And it's a pretty basic, simple argument. So we got an email from Will in Melbourne who says that he enjoys the podcast and what he describes as civil, honest contest of ideas, and here's one we're having now. But 25% tax export on the exports. He asks, is there any research, Tony? But he's 26 years old. He's doing a master's degree, and he says he's always associated myself with the Labor Party, and I've become increasingly frustrated by their inaction on many issues because they failed to grasp the mood for economic change. And when they do, the response is either too late or half-assed. And if they don't take up this policy, I and many others like me will be bitterly disappointed. And then this, if David Pocock had a national movement, I would jump on board in a heartbeat. I made that reference last week. If there was a sort of a Pauline Hanson equivalent or a Teals equivalent to taking votes away from the coalition, it would be a David Pocock-like movement that would start taking a lot of Labor votes away if they remain disappointed, as Will is, about the pace of change.
Yeah, I admire Pocock as a political operator and performer, and I've made the point before that if he were to become the leader of the Greens, I think the Greens would start cannibalising a lot of Labor vote. But at the moment, Larissa Waters, half of Greens voters say they've never heard of her. And I'm sure she's a fine person working hard, but she has not got that profile and ability to communicate that someone like Pocock does. Now, I can't see Pocock joining the Greens and leading the Greens, but he's certainly a very impressive communicator. But I think it's also worth noting that, and I think the resource rent tax is not fit for purpose. I think there is scope to revisit that, notwithstanding that, there was a commitment to not change it for 10 years. But it's also got to be said that Pocock and others who've been active this week in the media, a lot of them want to wipe out the gas industry. They don't want to support it. They use Norway as an example. Well, the Norway government not only invests heavily in the exploration and infrastructure provision, which the Australian government doesn't do, which is one of the reasons why it's a different taxation treatment. But Norway, to borrow a Trumpian phrase, they want to drill, and get it out as quickly as possible. There's no pretense from them that they want to end their gas export market. So, they don't want to support the gas market. I think that needs to be established first and foremost, and that's their right.
I don't think it's the greatest motivation, though. I think the motivation really is that Australians should get more bucks for the resources that they own. And our system is one of the worst in the world.
Yeah.
We give it away.
If I was advising the gas industry, I would say to them, you're probably not going to get any changes come through at this budget, but we've seen this movie before. There is a broad consensus building. You've got Hanson making comments. You've got Andrew Hastie being supportive. And it's probably going to happen at some point. Albanese has to negotiate that fact that he's given a commitment and he's got to manage the relationships with our security partners. If I were you guys, you've got leverage right now because of the importance with the export market with the security partners, but also as a transition fuel. The Clean Energy Council, AEMO, have all said gas is critical. They used to demonise gas a little bit, but in their recent conferences, and I was a guest speaker at the Clean Energy Council recently, their international convention, and the two lead speeches were all about the importance of gas as a transition. So I'd be saying use your leverage that you've got right now, accept that there's probably going to be change, and try and find that sweet spot where it's still a profitable industry and you still want to invest, but then also get the changes they want. Because they want a lot of changes with planning, approvals and so forth, exploration and so forth, because there's a lot of cost that goes into it. They're making a lot of money, there's no doubt. But try and get something where you get something, you neutralise or cauterise this issue, which is building in the electorate, and everyone walks out with something.
In the budget, first of all, and then between the budget and the election, if they don't do anything on this, I don't think they'll be able to walk away from it. I think it'll just keep coming back at them from their own constituency. They've just had the inquiry in Parliament. Of course, the Coalition was against it. The Greens were for it. People like David Pocock were for it. At some stage, they're going to have to line up with their own constituency in some way or another. It just can't go on in the way that it is.
I think one of the interesting developments this week is the opinion piece put out by both Mike Baird, former New South Wales Liberal Premier, and Anna Bligh, former Labor Premier of Queensland, both who served, I think combined 12 years in Parliament for two of the biggest states. And Anna Bligh, of course, resource state in Queensland. They wrote about how there's no end of reform ideas, economic reform ideas. What there's a shortage of is the preconditions for those reforms. This very fragmented media market, the fragmented tribalism, and this sort of the risk of putting forward big ideas. Because we haven't had big reform in this country for 26, 27 years. And they're talking about building this broader consensus amongst business, unions, and governments, including the oppositions, to stop using as a political football these ideas to have a big reform. Because you can look at the resource rent tax, but better would be just a holistic review of the tax system. And I know this has been done before, and Rudd tried to do it with the Henry Review, but of course it gets politicised.
Well, speaking of Ken Henry, he was one who said, just get on with it and stop this crap. I'm with him on that. Look, the economic mood, something has to give anyway, because the NAB latest update was the 1 in 2 chance of falling into recession by the end of the year. The economy, this, by the way, is the worst case scenario,
Yes,
really.
yeah.
They're tossing around all sorts of possibilities. The economy could shrink by as much as 2%. Unemployment could spike to 9% next year. They are grim numbers.
Yeah.
They could really do with the big bucks from the gas industry.
Yeah, NAB heavily caveated the report, as you said, to sort of say this was worst case. But of course, the fact that this is even discussed as the worst case is alarming. And the big X factor right now is, the Middle East. There just does not seem to be any end to that. And Trump, I don't think he knows how to fix it now. And he certainly doesn't have the intellectual horsepower around him, Hegseth and Kash Patel and so forth. I recommend the Atlantic story on Kash Patel to any of the listeners that have time this weekend. It's just a fascinating but terrifying account. But I think in terms of economic reform, and again, I come back to that McKinnon Institute, what's really important to acknowledge is that we're $1 trillion in debt. Now, a lot of that debt was accumulated before the Albanese government came in, and in 2019, there was a structural deficit of $85 billion. So I'm certainly not suggesting this is the fault of the Albanese government, but they haven't cut spending. Spending has been accelerating, and now we've got this huge debt, which requires around $29 billion a year just in interest repayments. It doesn't touch a cent of debt. And it's kind of interesting because this week was the 20th anniversary of when Costello paid off all debt. So we were debt-free as a country 20 years ago this week. And it's a reminder of, just like a household budget with mortgages, like crippling interest rates, crippling interest repayments really inhibits your ability to expand services. You've discussed before the haves, the must-haves, and the nice-to-haves in terms of government spending. And the must-haves is health. And, state governments have got wait lists for up to 18 months for hip replacements, and that's not really acceptable. It's one of those issues that, for a country like Australia, not having sort of people, particularly elderly people, living in agony for 18 months is just, non-negotiable.
I don't know what's in your polling bag this week, but there's polling around One Nation and it dropped a bit, but within the range of error. So the discussion is whether Pauline Hanson has peaked or not. I don't know, maybe flatlined. But what do you think? I don't think the figures were really substantial enough to make any judgment one way or the other.
Yeah, no, we've got a poll in the field right now. But I think there's going to be a bit of data noise. Probably the main takeout to me from the 3 polls that were released this week is, for all the pressure that Albanese's been under about fuel security, and the coalition's been attacking him on that relentlessly, and the coalition's immigration policy, which is now about a week and a half old, the polls didn't move. And it should be a reminder. Now, you rarely get an initial response unless it's huge, a huge policy. You rarely get an instant move, and it takes time to get through to the electorate. And as I said, there's all these sort of proxy campaigns that might be, through interest groups or community groups. There's all the social media algorithms that are happening that, you and I can't even see, different groups that people follow, where they get information. And then opinions might start moving, and they might start moving against the coalition on that particular immigration policy. But their initial response was meh, and business as usual.
Well, there are a couple of by-elections coming up. The first one in a week's time is Nepean, a state by-election in Victoria. It's odd in a way that Labor actually held that seat only 4 years ago, and they're not in the market. They're not in the field. But that will be a contest, it seems. Look, I'm not underestimating the independent. Something could happen there, but the likelihood is it'll be a contest between the Liberal Party, which should win it, and One Nation. But then you move on to the Farrer by-election. And whatever happens there, the most extraordinary thing about that, I think almost certainly, because the coalition, the Liberals and the National Parties are both in the field, and neither of them are really polling strong enough. It seems almost certain that for the first time in our history, two candidates other than somebody from the major parties will finish first and second. We've never had that before. And it would be One Nation and the independent Michelle Milthorpe.
Yeah. Obviously, preference is going to be critically important there. My tummy compass says with the Nats and the Libs reportedly getting, combined in the 20s and One Nation in the 30s, they're going to be in a very well placed. It's going to depend on the preference flows and preference discipline. If One Nation wins, of course, then they've got a foothold in the House of Reps, and that's potentially a very bad thing for the coalition.
Got Barnaby there now.
Yep.
He wasn't elected.
No,
under the One Nation banner,
but to actually
as a national.
have a foothold, and James Campbell wrote an interesting piece this week. I mean, it's a diabolical situation for the coalition, like diabolical, because as James argued, if you get another effective teal into Parliament, well, it's just one more, not ideal for the coalition. But if you get another One Nation MP in, it legitimises the party even more. It creates a permission structure for more One Nation MPs. But accordingly, as he noted, he had a number of comments off the record from Liberal MPs and said, our branches are on fire. If we don't preference One Nation, there's a riot. So it's a wicked, wicked situation.
It is a wicked situation, but look at it this way. There is the prospect. This election is so important to One Nation, this by-election. They haven't had a candidate elected to the House of Representatives since Pauline Hanson. And so this would be, historically, very, very important. Now, imagine if that was to happen. Imagine the boost they would get to the number of volunteers, to donors, media coverage. Yep. They would get real momentum handed to them on a plate by their opponents, by the Liberal Party and the National Party. Why would they do that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the arguments put forward, and Cos, my business partner, former Labor strategist, he made the point, which I think he's right, and I've got no answers on this one. It's too hard for me. His point was the Liberal primary vote is now so low that it's the small C Conservatives are no longer part of that voting bloc. So you're not really sort of losing what you've got by preferencing One Nation. The problem is you're not also going to grow your primary vote anymore
but you're giving them a boost.
Exactly.
You're giving them a boost. Look, there's another theory going around that within the strategists within the Liberal Party feel, look, they can't win this time at the by-election. Clearly they can't because of the polling. They might be better placed, though, next time. If Michelle Milford was to win, as independents tend to do, she'll be really hard to shift at the general election, right? But if One Nation wins, who knows what might happen in the political climate of the next 2 years, and they would have a much better chance of winning the seat next time around. That's another theory. And Paul Felix has emailed, and he wants to talk too about strategic voting. The LNP uses preferences to keep Labor out of office. Not very well recently. Labor uses preferences to sort of do the same thing, right? So he says strategic voting, and I'm paraphrasing him, I'm leaving a bit out, but strategic voting is becoming more common in the UK, with progressive parties working together to prevent the Tories winning seats. Hopefully all parties will unite to prevent Farage winning the next election. But it's strategic voting is part of the equation, isn't it?
Yeah, it was a really interesting email from Paul. We've been seeing that for some time now in our research, particularly with younger voters. And Teal voters and Greens voters who the outcome they want might be, say, to use a federal example, they might not necessarily rate the Albanese government on climate change, for instance. They think that they're getting dragged kicking and screaming, and they're kind of not too dissimilar from the coalition. This is the feedback in the focus groups. So they think that by voting Teals or Greens, they're going to put pressure. They want an Albanese government elected. That's the tactic. But by voting for the Teal or Green, they're putting the wind up the sails of the preferred Prime Minister or Premier to actually take their issue seriously. So it's kind of a modern day version of Don Chip, keep the bastards honest.
Yeah. And just before we take a break, another email from Neil Statton, and we've talked about this the last couple of weeks, but the difference between populism and popularity. He says that Tony Abbott promised to cut taxes while improving government services. That's populism. Mamdani in New York made promises paid for by taxing the rich. He says it's popular, but it's not populist.
Yeah. I would argue Abbott's comment wasn't populist, just bad. I'm sure he regrets that to this day. He didn't need to say it. It was on the eve of the election, and I think it was on SBS. I found a quote because we've had quite a lot of interesting debate about this on the emails about a definition of populist. Because, of course, there's no technical definition of a populist in terms of, a point system or, But Mamdani himself described his win in the primary against Cuomo, who was very much establishment, former governor of New York. He described it as a left-wing populist victory, and he said this shows that this can be replicated across the US, because as we know, the Democrats are in a lot of trouble. Like they're pretty hard to be elected, and I would maintain that. Yes, there are preconditions for Trump and his right-wing populism and his reductive solutions to everything, and certainly over the flyover states. But I would also say that he was helped a lot by two very poor candidates in Hillary Clinton, who wasn't changed, she was establishment, and then Kamala Harris, who was the vice president to Biden. The only time when he had a good candidate who was well past his prime, I mean, in his day, Biden was a formidable political figure in the United States, very formidable, but he was well past his prime, and he beat him. Not that Trump has accepted that, but I think that sort of shows that, the Democrats are not very competitive at the moment, and they do need to change. I think Rahm Emanuel is a really interesting prospect, a former Obama chief of staff, and I think he worked for Clinton. He would be fascinating, but he's very much old school Democrat and very establishment. So whether he gets the support or not is it's a big discussion in America right now. But that Mamdani sort of approach is, I think it's got a lot of legs.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look. After the break, we'll come back and see how Donald Trump's doing with the blockade in the Strait of Hormuz.
Welcome back, Barry. I've been trying to crystal ball what's happening in the Straits of Hormuz, and I've given up on trying to predict what Trump will do. Where do you think it's at?
Well, I'm really fascinated by this whole concept of simultaneous blockade. So, look, Iran is blocking the strait in the way that they kind of have from the start. The United States is blocking Iran ports and to try and block food and goods. I mean, really, simultaneous blockades, they could take a week about and let some of the crew go off on R&R. It just seems so. I might sound a bit flippant about it, but the point is that Trump is now saying that the US is back in control of the Strait of Hormuz. Back in control. If that's true, then wave the oil tankers through, right? It's a nonsense claim to make. And then as you're doing that, don't forget there are 20 or 30 mines just floating around there that are still a risk. It's I think people must be so confused by this, but at least there is some progress, slow progress on the peace talks, and particularly on I think the one sticking point on in terms of Iran and United States and Israel is over the time limit on guarantees they'll give around enrichment. The US wants 20 years and Iran's talking 5 or something. The other breakdown is still an uneasy and a fragile ceasefire, but the talk is that there will be a 3-week ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. But that's Israel and Lebanon. It's not Israel and Hezbollah. And Hezbollah might just say, well, we don't care what you say. The president of Lebanon could go to the White House with the Prime Minister of Israel. But without Hezbollah's input, what does it really mean? So it's one step forward, one step backwards.
I think what's becoming very clear, though, is that Iran is prepared to endure a lot more pain because they know that in the long term they are causing Trump and the global economy untold grief.
Yeah.
And they got massive leverage over that. And it was a huge miscalculation. And by the way, predicted by many, many, many experts. If you read all sorts of opinion pieces preceding this, they warned of this exact circumstance, which Trump seems to have overlooked.
Yeah, and that's the point. Like Iran being a closed society and the United States an open society, it's hard to read what's going on in Iran, but Iran does know through the openness of the country and the media reporting that it's becoming very uncomfortable for Donald Trump in his own country. Well, that's it for today. This podcast was made on the sovereign lands of the Wurundjeri people. It was produced by Daniel Simo and video production Burton Hewin.
The executive producer is Hannah Parks.
I'm Barrie Cassidy.
And I'm Tony Barry. And this is Back Barries, a Guardian Australia podcast.